Thank you for following me, if you would please, over to Jeremiah 18. You may have noticed already this week that we're in the midst of camping season. We're going to do some camping this morning. We're going to camp at Jeremiah 18 for a little bit. I don't know if you realize this or not, but preachers sometimes get stuck for a sermon. Have no clue what they're going to talk about. That's kind of where Jeremiah was at. And God, being the practical God that He is, He had an assignment for Jeremiah, knowing that Jeremiah was looking for a sermon. God said, Jeremiah, if you go down the street, there's a potter's studio, and I'd like you to pay the potter a visit. And so that's what we find here as we begin in Jeremiah 18. We find Jeremiah going to the potter's house looking for a sermon. And it all begins here in verses 1 and 2. And the word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Arise and go down to the potter's house, and there I will cause you to hear my words. Since this little story took place in 605 BC, there's no doubt but what Jeremiah was very familiar with pots. He knew that pots were used for almost everything, especially in the kitchens of the residents of Judea at this time. They were used to store fruit in. Pots were used to store grain in. Pots were used to wash clothes in. Hopefully not the same pots. Pots were used for refrigeration, particularly liquids. They could place liquids in these porous pots, and the evaporation would begin to cool the contents. So pots were literally used for everything. But I have a strong suspicion that Jeremiah wasn't quite as familiar with what took place in the potter's studio. Part of the reason for God's assignment to Jeremiah. And so we follow Jeremiah down to the potter's studio, and there we notice verse 3. Then I went down to the potter's house, and there he was, making something at the wheel. Actually, there were probably two wheels. A large stone wheel, probably about this big around, placed low, positioned on a base that would allow it to spin. In the middle of this round flywheel stone would be a post, a short post, probably about 2.5 feet long, through the middle of this wheel. And now perched on the top of this vertical post is a second wheel, much smaller wheel, probably only about 8 or 9 inches across. And it's on that smaller wheel that the potter would plop down his lump of damp clay. And undoubtedly what would happen, the potter then would stand either leaning against the wall with one foot on the lower stone so he could begin to push it, or he would sit on a stool that would allow him to push and spin that lower wheel. And of course, the centrifugal movement of that lower wheel would cause the spinning, the rapid spinning of the upper wheel, fast enough so that it would allow the potter to mold and shape the clay that's on the upper wheel. And so that's precisely what happened the day that Jeremiah went to the potter's studio. But the most significant thing to happen was yet to be seen. And we notice that here in verse 3. Then I went down to the potter's house, and there he was making something at the wheel. And then, horror of horrors, it began to fly apart. And we notice here, something must have happened. Either there was a lump in the clay, or Kathy could probably tell you about her experience watching Lori in her potter's studio, where Kathy worked as a potter's helper for at least a couple years. Sometimes things happen when the potter goes to shape this lump of clay positioned on this spinning wheel. And it could either be a lump of clay or some inconsistency in the clay, or of course, the potter could use the wrong pressure in the wrong place, or even something as small as a hangnail, something irregularity on a finger could cause something to go wrong with the clay. And that's exactly what happened. Something went wrong. And we notice here in verse 4. And from verse 4, we're going to glean a central idea. But we're going to take that central idea and break it down into 3 parts. And the primary idea that I think God wants to communicate, not only to Jeremiah, but to those that Jeremiah would deliver the message to, was that there's going to be failure in life. You don't expect it. Much of it you don't intend on happening, but there's going to be failures. And the most significant thing is not the fact that you're going to encounter failure in the journey of life, but what happens after the failures. And so our primary idea is that no one is ever a failure who is committed to God's will for their lives. No one. Oh, you're going to fail now and then. No doubt about it. Just as surely as the potter had the pot fly to pieces, you're going to see things kind of come apart at the seams now and then. It's going to happen. Expect it. It's going to be there. It's not a question of if it's going to happen, but it's only a question of when, and even more importantly, what's my reaction to it? It's going to come. And so, the life committed to God cannot be a failure. You will fail, but as we're going to notice, those failures are part of the process of going down the road of success. If I have surrendered my life to God, and my life is in His hands. So, let's begin by noticing the first part of verse 4. And that's where we're going to glean our first lesson from. Verse 4, first part. And the vessel that he made of clay was marred in the hand of the potter. Oh, I don't want to discourage you. But as I've already suggested, failure's going to come. And if you have the courage to go back through your memory file folder, you'll find them. And they may be a long ways back, but my friend, you never forget them. You may heal from them. You may begin to recover from them. And even more importantly, hopefully you learn something from them. But the reality is, failures not only come, but they're usually so profound that they stick in your memory. Oh, I could make a long list of my failures. Preachers do stupid things sometimes, and usually it involves a vehicle. We hadn't owned this Nissan pickup very long. And I pulled up on to the entry, the apron for the garage. We lived in a parsonage, perched on a hill. And the approach to the garage was really, or essentially, an uphill climb. I was out doing some visiting, swung back by the house, pulled up, didn't have time to pull it in the garage, so I parked it in the driveway. And I set the emergency brake, or so I thought. I dashed inside, and Kathy was making popcorn balls. Remember it to this day, and it's been 30 years ago. You don't forget these moments. I quickly grabbed a popcorn ball, stepped out of the house, walked out to get in my pickup that was now gone. 3 minutes, I was in the house, and now it's gone. And I began to frantically look around. And when it wasn't in the driveway and it wasn't in the street, I looked down the street. And it had rolled 2 blocks down the street, jumped the curb, glanced off of a tree in the neighbor's yard, and stopped at the neighbor's wall. Oh my, those failures you don't forget. A little more recent failure, some of you know that one of my favorite pastimes is wilderness camping. And there's one thing about wilderness camping, is that you don't forget your mistakes there either, because it can literally be a life and death matter. And it was a number of years ago. Kathy had went up to camp with me using our pack animals. We had decided it was time to break camp, load up the pack animals, put Kathy on her riding animal, her Molly mule, and in 6 inches of snow, we headed down the trail back to the trailhead. Went about 1.5 miles out to where the trail drops down a steep hillside, a series of switchbacks going down the aspen hillside. And it was all going real fine, being very cautious because with that additional wet snow, the trail was very slippery. And here we are going down this steep hillside. And we got about halfway down the hillside when I heard Kathy holler, "Stop!" And I immediately stopped and turned around and looked. And the mule that she was riding, the saddle was now up on its neck. I thought, sure, I forgot that I saddled that mule that day. Kathy thinks it was my son that saddled it. But at any rate, either my son or myself forgot to put the breeching under the tail. And you don't go down a steep hillside without putting the breeching under the tail, because otherwise the breeching will come up over the rump of the animal and the saddle will come sliding forward. And that's exactly what happened. And she sensed the saddle was sliding forward, and she reached out and caught an aspen tree to catch her balance with. And she knew there was no way she was going to stay on that mule, and she came sliding off of that mule. Fortunately, the trail was deeply embedded in the hillside, so she didn't have very far to fall, but it was far enough to make her pretty concerned about how that mule was saddled. A failure that day. As children, we fail. Do you remember as a child hearing somebody say, pick up your clothes, make your bed? Oh, how easy it is for children to forget their chores. One of my childhood memories was I had went down to my grandmother's, lived a block down the highway from where we lived, wandered out across the field to the pond where I, as a boy, did some fishing. Borrowed my dad's spinning rod, wandered out across the field to the pond, did some fishing. Came back and was walking through my grandmother's yard and decided to go in and see my grandmother. So I laid the fishing rod down there next to the porch, forgetting that my uncle's dog, a young lab retriever, was out in the yard. You can guess what the handle on that fishing rod looked like when I came out the door. My dad reminded me that I had failed that day to remember what dogs can do to fishing rods. And if that's not enough, we fail as teenagers, don't we? Just when we finally get a date set up with that special person, and at just the right moment in the evening, when you have the words memorized, you want to say something that so impresses her. And it all comes out kind of garbled. And you feel like a fool at the moment. And we sometimes fail as spouses. We don't intend to do it, but we say hurtful things. At least I do. And it leaves you feeling like a failure. Oh, how deeply what we say can hurt our spouses. And then, of course, we have grand dreams for our babies when they're born, only to discover as they grow up that they're not quite so interested in those dreams that you had for them. And we feel like failures as parents. You begin to get the picture? Life is a continuous string, not so much of successes as failures, if you're living life. That was the message for Jeremiah at the studio. The pot is invariably going to be marred, going to be broken, going to come apart. But that brings us to the second idea that I think is worth noticing here, and that is in the second half of verse 4. And so he made it again another vessel as it seemed to the potter to make. I don't have any choice sometimes in the failures I experience. But I always have a choice in what I will do with those failures. There is nothing that contributes to success like the lessons learned from a failure. One successful football coach described it this way. He said, "We learn practically nothing from victory. A winner forgets most of his mistakes." And I would tag on, a failure forgets almost none of those mistakes. And hopefully the lessons learned. He saw the pot and he said, so he made it again into another vessel. What does God do with us when we have failures? What does he do with us? A little girl at the kitchen table inadvertently knocks over her glass of milk, and her 3 older brothers aren't slow to let her know that she really blew it. And so here's milk running all over the table, and she has her head in her hands crying. What does Daddy do? This takes us back a generation maybe, when Daddy sat at the tables with families in the evening. Well, this Daddy realized what had happened. He instinctively stepped out of his chair and took the step over to the little girl and knelt down and said, "Here, honey." And he threw his arms around her, picked her up, and went back over and sat down in his chair and held her in his lap and said, "Honey, it's going to be okay. I still love you." Amen. But he didn't stop there. He said, "By the way, honey, I think your mother would really appreciate it if you'd help her clean up the mess." A loving daddy doesn't just throw his arms around her and reassure her that everything's going to be okay. He sometimes helps us do it over again. Helps us learn from what we have went through. Helps us try it again. Sometimes when we really feel guilty, feel like failures, we want Jesus to throw his arms around us and hold us. When in reality, Jesus does that, but he instinctively also says, "I am here to help you try it over again. Let's see if we can try it over again and do it differently next time." Amen. He's there to help us succeed through our failures. Not reject us because of them. And so Jeremiah noticed he did it again. You see, the easiest thing to do when we've failed is to quit, to get discouraged and quit. I'm just here to remind you, folks, that's outside of God's plan. I believe he comforts us. He sends people to encourage us when we feel like we least deserve it. But then he provides opportunities to learn from it and to do it over again. But maybe to do it over again a different way the next time. Because you see, again, if I'm ultimately a failure because of my failings, it's only because I'm trying to operate outside of God's plan for my life. The only way you can ever fail is if you step outside of what you understand God's will for your life to be. And that's our last insight. Notice with me here in part B, and so he made it again into another vessel as it seemed good to the potter to make. The only way my failures will bring me to be a failure is if I'm operating outside of God's design for my life. And make no mistake about it, he put you in a specific home with specific circumstances. And sometimes those circumstances aren't all that encouraging. But nonetheless, he put you there where you had to deal with certain circumstances. And then you went through life experiencing certain experiences. And all of that's to be combined with your heredity to be part of the design of the potter. God has a plan. The potter has a plan for the kind of vessel he wants you to be. And the only question is, am I surrendered to the plan that God is using to shape my life into what it is becoming? Now, sometimes what short circuits that process is I can become so fixated on what I think I should be I mean, after all, I'm a 5'6" guy, or I'm a 6-foot girl, and I'm convinced God made a major mistake here. Because I have different plans for my life. Maybe as a 5'6" guy, or teenager at least, my plan was to be a star on the football team. And my size just doesn't tend to go that direction. And so I kind of wonder about God's plan. And the tendency is to maybe question a bit, if not outright reject God's plan for my life because of His design for me. We fellows kind of poke fun at ladies that become enamored with appearance. I mean, after all, what lady wouldn't rather be the ornate china pitcher, admired by those that walk by, setting on the china hutch shelf, than be a plastic pitcher that's used in the kitchen every day? Maybe God didn't design you to be the ornate, fragile, attractive china pitcher. In our house, we have crystal china. Over the years, my wife has hosted crystal china parties, and so she's accumulated quite a collection of crystal china, lead china. It's one of her favorite possessions. Most of it sits most of the time in the china hutch, there to be admired and pulled out for special occasions. On the other hand, we have a different type of pitcher in our house, and that's a plastic pitcher that I put my decaffeinated green tea in every day. Not real pretty, but oh, it's functional. Very durable. It can survive hitting the tile floor in our kitchen. But it'll never be seen sitting on the shelf in the china hutch. Oh, that we might be content with the role that God has given us in life, yielding ourselves into the hand of the potter. Abraham Lincoln put it this way. He receives credit for saying a lot of things. Most of them are really very good. I can't guarantee that he said this, but I think it's worth repeating even if he didn't. It goes something like this: we can complain because rose bushes have thorns, or rejoice because thorn bushes have roses. Did you catch that? It's all about perspective and recognizing what the potter is trying to do in your life. Paul, let's go for just a moment over to Romans chapter 9. Romans 9, verse 21. He says, does not the potter have power over the clay from the same lump to make one vessel for honor and another for dishonor? A different version of the Bible put it this way: one vessel for beauty and another vessel for menial purposes. It's all in the design of the potter, and my being willing to accept the design of the potter, accepting what I was designed to be, and building on that, even with my failures, because nothing helps us grow like failure. little analogy as we close. Have you ever, fellows, tried to turn a screw with a claw hammer? Have you ever tried to pull a nail with a screwdriver? Probably in desperation, we've all tried. But it didn't work very well. Probably didn't come out very good. Don't you see? A hammer was never designed to turn screws. A screwdriver was never designed to pull nails. They each fail or succeed depending on the design, what they were created to be used for. That's really what Paul is saying here. And some of us were designed as hammers. Some of us are designed to be screwdrivers. Some of us are designed to be plastic pitchers. Some of us are designed to be ornate china pitchers. It's all in recognizing the design of the potter. As we come to the close, let's go back to the beginning, may we, for just a minute. Back to the very, very beginning at the Garden of Eden. Here we find the Creator God as the original master potter, kneeling down in the clay, reaching out and taking a lump of clay, and he begins to fashion it into Adam's head. And he puts the ears out to each side, and the eyes just below the eyebrow ridges. And then perched right in the middle, he puts the nose. And below the nose is the mouth. And then God said, everything is good. We can't imagine the ear complaining because he's not out front, perched where the nose is. We can't imagine the eye being frustrated because it's not down in the position where the mouth is, being able to communicate like the mouth. God succeeded because every part of his creation accepted what it was created for, yielding to the hand of the potter and knowing that it's all very good. You will only become a failure if you're trying to operate outside of God's plan for your life. God never planned for you to be a failure. He only planned for you to succeed in spite of your failures. Sometimes because of your failures. And so, I love the words of the closing hymn. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mold me and make me after thy will, while I am waiting, yielded and still. Yielded to the hands of the potter. That's where we want to be. Should we make that our prayers? We sing our closing hymn.